Thank you, Alex. First, I have some acknowledgments. So many of my heroes are here tonight that I'm just blown away, not only by this event, but just by their presence. Natan Sharansky, one of the great heroes of all time of the Jewish people. We'll hear from him later. Joel Spray-Reagan, who was mentioned, who was one of my mentors, one of the very first people involved in the Soviet Jewry movement in the early 70s, and one of the first chair of Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry. My friend Pam Cohn, who was chairman of Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry for so many years, and then became the chairman of the national organization, the Union of Councils of Soviet Jews, and who spent, unbelievable, tireless hours, often in the middle of the night, speaking to refuseniks on the telephone. We're blessed tonight to have Ron and June Daniels here, who were chairs of the South Florida Conference on Soviet Jewry, and we're also board members of the Union of Councils of Soviet Jewry. We're honored to have Betsy Gidwitz here tonight, who has been the chair of the Jewish Agency Division of the Russian Committee for many, many years and makes numerous trips 2-3 times a year to the Soviet Union and the Ukraine. And finally, my friend, mentor, and truly one of our great heroes, my buddy Steve Nassiter. And I was really one of the soldiers. I guess I rose to the rank of lieutenant in this movement. But really, this award I'm getting belongs to all of you in this room who are participants in the Soviet Jewry movement, who visited the former Soviet Union, who supported Chicago Action and the Federation involvement in Soviet Jewry, who went to the march, all of those who supported Operation Exodus, who gave to Federation, all the incredible JUF staff, and all the volunteer host families. This is truly your award. And in fact, tonight, this is not an award, this is our reward for all that we've done, none of which we've ever asked for thanks for. Herzl said, "If you will it, it is no dream." But as much as I and others willed freedom for Soviet Jews, I must confess tonight is a dream. As I sat here, I had chills just listening to these young people and seeing who they are, what they've done, and what they've become. From the moment I was told the Russian Jewish Division planned this event, I have been flooded with emotions and memories. I recall the many who worked so hard as part of Chicago Action and who are no longer with us, Marilyn Tallman and Hetty DeLuey, and those at Federation, including many of its professionals, such as Joel Shinsky and Michael Kotzen. May their memories be for a blessing. I recall the faces of the refuseniks I met in Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev in 1980 and in my second trip, 1983. Kasana, Blitzstein, Michael and Lev Elbert, Gorodetsky, Slapak, Stoller, Abramovich, Taratuta, Natasha Beckman, Kogans, and so many others. Unbelievably brave people, the bravest people I've ever met, all of whom were willing to sacrifice their careers, jobs, freedom, and security so that they, and most importantly, their children, could be free to live as proud Jews and realize their unfettered potential as human beings. I recall as if it were yesterday my being at a Federation Dialogues group in 1978 and listening to Pam Cohn speak of her trip to the FSU. She spoke about the refuseniks and the work of Chicago Action. And I didn't know about refuseniks, and I didn't know what was going on in the Soviet Union with Soviet Jews. But I instantly enlisted. I went to Chicago Action's offices, and I met with Marilyn Tallman and Pam. These were tiny little offices on First Street, filled with 5 or 6 desks, cluttered with clothes, blue jeans, medicines, books, and religious articles for visitors to take to the former Soviet Union. And that was one of the most important things Chicago Action did, was to send tourists to the Soviet Union, and many of my friends who went are in this room today. And I have to digress and tell you that when the refuseniks finally started to get out in the late 80s, and they would come to Chicago to pay homage and to thank us, and they would go and see the Chicago Action office, and it was always the exact same reaction. This is it? I remember them saying, and the KGB thought that you were like the size of the Pentagon. Truly, that you made such a tumult here with all these visitors and with all these telephone calls. And literally, when you would knock on the door of someone's house, and I remember Natasha Kostina, the first person I visited in 1980, 11 o'clock at night, you knock on the door and you say shalom, they're used to visitors, and she opens it up and you say, Pamela Cohn sent me. Her name was Pamela there. And they throw their arms around you. Welcome. Pam and Marilyn gave me the names of 3 refuseniks to write to. They said, this is how you start, and you start contributing to Chicago Action. And one of the refusenik families were Isaac and Sophia Kogan, Yitzhak Kogan in Leningrad. Yitzhak had become a self-taught Lubavitch Rebbe and a shochet, and was teaching people Hebrew in his home. So on my first trip, the last place we went to was Leningrad. I could not write to them and tell them I was going to show up because the KGB opens up the letters, and I would never have gotten in the country. And so we had trouble finding his apartment. I knew the Cyrillic alphabet. We couldn't exactly find the right apartment. And all of a sudden, out of sort of another entrance, I see Yitzhak Kogan walk out because I had seen his photograph. And I went over to him, and he was used to visitors. And he said, can I help you? And I said, yes, we're looking for Yitzhak Kogan. He says, that's me. Come on to my house. So we walked in the apartment. I was with a woman named Betty Kahn, Allah Shalom, who was the photographer. And I said, Yitzhak, this is Betty Kahn, and I'm Harvey Barnett. And he didn't hear me right. He said, you know Harvey Barnett? I said, no, I am Harvey Barnett. And with that, he gave me a bear hug that I could still feel today. And one of the first things he said was, I'm getting to the good part. He said, in one of your first letters, you put a postscript on that you said maybe we're related because your family was from Vitebsk, Russia. He says, that's where I'm from, Vitebsk, which is where Mark Chagall's from. And I said, well, the family name was Itkin. He says, that's me. I'm an Itkin. And this man, whose name was given me out of 20,000 refuseniks, was one of my cousins. The Kogans left in 1987. They had 5 private audiences with the Lubavitch Rebbe. He started the organization called Children of Chernobyl to save kids from Russia who were victims of the Chernobyl disaster, Jewish kids who the Russians were refusing to treat. And he and his son have been the head rabbi of the Chabad in Moscow ever since. In many respects, that first trip became a defining moment in my life. Like those in the Soviet Jewry movement, I became obsessed with obtaining freedom of our brothers and sisters. I joined the work of Chicago Action, raising funds. We were educating others in the cause. I joined the board of the Union of Councils. And most importantly, we, in the Federation system, lobbied Congress and the administration, along with so many others. We had congressmen adopting refuseniks. These are congressmen who are in Wyoming and Montana. And trust me, you can't get a minion in Wyoming and Montana. And they were writing letters to the ambassador, Russian ambassador, on behalf of refuseniks saying, let these people go. And at the same time, Chicago had a conference on Soviet Jewry that was led by Roman Kahn, who's here tonight, and staffed by Richard Zellin, who's here tonight. And they were busy doing the same thing. So Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. He saw a crumbling Soviet Union. It needed trade with the West. They were blocked by the Jackson-Vanik Amendment because they weren't honoring human rights. And due to the lobbying efforts of our organizations and Congress, and thank the Lord for Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, because they let Gorbachev know that the quid pro quo for trade with the West was to open the gates to emigration for Soviet Jews. And in 1986, it started. Natan was released, and then came some of our heroes, the prisoners of Zion, Mendelevich, Slapak, Yuli Edelstein, Ida Nudell. You saw some of them in that video of the march. These are former prisoners of Zion or people who had spent years and years in the Gulag. And then came the march on December 6, 1987, Natan Sharansky's brainchild. Gorbachev was going to come to Washington to meet with Reagan the next day. Now, there was no internet. There weren't any faxes. We communicated by telephones, and he actually had to dial a number. And no one knew, and I didn't know, how large a gathering this would be. I just read this morning that the largest gathering of Jews to protest anything in Washington before this was 16,000 people. No one knew. But the word was out. Federations were sending out the word. We were sending out the word. And I remember arriving at the mall in Washington on a freezing December day, December 6th, and standing there wondering how many people are going to be there. And all of a sudden, the buses came. And another bus, and another bus, unloading people with the signs you saw, Free Soviet Jewry, the buttons. And as more and more of these people came off, I stood there and I literally wept. I had been at this for 12 years, and it blew me away. And I wept because I knew in my gut that we had won. And then we heard Pam Cohn introduced Natan Sharansky, who spoke to the crowd. And we heard from Mendelevich, Slapak, Edelstein, and Nudell. A letter was read from Ronald Reagan to Gorbachev that said, release all the refuseniks and permit emigration of Soviet Jews. It was surreal. I truly felt the dream was to be realized. The gates were going to open. The exodus was going to happen. And it did. And when you really think about it in retrospect, this was the second largest power in the world, the Soviet Union, a nuclear power, a totalitarian regime. And as they told Natan Sharansky when he was first arrested, you'll never get out of here. This is a movement that started, it's all a bunch of housewives and students. And the students were the first ones. The students struggled for Soviet Jewry. And the housewives were the first ones to start things like Chicago Action. You'll never get out of here. Well, they succumbed. We brought them to their knees, which just proves, don't ever estimate the power of a Jewish student, and particularly Jewish women. And remember who led us out of Egypt. It was the Jewish women. And now, in my other hat, I have been blessed to be involved with the Jewish Federation of Chicago since the mid-'80s. It's the finest federation in the country. Don't have time to tell you all the reasons why. We are the best. We're the leaders. All the other federations look to us in large part because of not only our lay leadership, but because of the incredible work of Steve Nassiter, who has been our head for 35 years. And you've heard about Operation Exodus. When the UJA, which was the national organization at that time, realized that the gates were going to open and that more and more Soviet Jews started to come out in the late 80s. They knew there might be massive immigration. No one knew how much. And there was a meeting held in New York of 30 to 40 of the richest Jewish families in the country. It was a breakfast meeting. It later became known as the Breakfast of Champions. Now, this is 1990. They raised close to $1 billion out of 30 to 40 families. And that was for resettlement in Israel. And then the federation system knew that we were going to be resettling Soviet Jews. We didn't know how many. But Chicago, as you would expect, rose to the occasion. Our annual campaign in 1990, that's for the whole year, was $53 million. On top of that, we raised $56 million from the Chicago Jewish community to resettle Soviet Jews. And we went to the Harris Bank, God bless them, and we borrowed $50 million at a very favorable interest rate, repayable over 20 years, $2.5 million a year, and we finished repaying that in 2010. And with that, we were able to resettle approximately 40,000 Jews, and you've heard we gave them food, shelter, clothing, medical, training, jobs, schools, etc. And now word to the Russian Jewish division. Almost 10 years ago, Alex Turek asked me to tell the Soviet Jewry story to the group who had stayed together from the Russian Hillels, which Federation had formed. And that group ultimately became the RJD. There were about 120 of you, and most of you had never heard about the refuseniks and their sacrifices or the difficulties of your parents emigrating. I finished my talk by saying the lesson learned is one person can make a difference in this world. And even more so, when the Jewish people are united, they can accomplish miracles and make dreams come true. To your credit, many of you asked, how can I make a difference? And I assured you, you can. Tonight, you made a difference. And you make a difference by what you do as part of Federation. You make a difference by how you conduct your lives as proud and contributing Jews. When I met with your leadership about this event, I expressed my belief that the two greatest human virtues are kindness and gratitude. Tonight, you express both. You have raised money to pay back Federation, and you demonstrate your gratitude for what so many of us strive to accomplish for your parents and the Jewish people. As I told your leadership, we never asked for payback. For us in the Soviet Jewry movement, and for all who gave or participated in Operation Exodus or hosted families, freedom for the Soviet Jews was the quintessential moment of Kol Yisrael Arivim Zeh Lezeh. All Israel's responsible one for the other. We were honored to serve in this mission, to obtain freedom for our brothers and sisters in the FSU, and to care for them when they emigrated. Tonight's the ultimate Kvel time for all of us gathered in this room. And to your parents, I say you should be very proud. You sacrificed to emigrate and come to this great country. It was not easy. Tonight we celebrate with you over this glorious moment in Jewish history 30 years ago and the freedom of our people. And we commend you for the mensches that you have raised. I say Yasher Koach. I say Yasher Koach to the RJD. May you and your members continue to go from strength to strength. You truly represent Am Yisrael Chai. Don't ever let the light go out. Thank you.